Most people believe calm comes after life finally slows down. After the problems are solved, the message is answered, the pressure lifted. But what if that's backwards? What if calm isn't something waiting at the end of the road, but something that appears the moment we stop running? There's a strange kind of hurry many people carry inside them. Nothing urgent may be happening at all, and yet the mind keeps racing. Thoughts stack up, the chest tightens, and a quiet voice whispers that stopping is dangerous, as if pausing for even a moment might cause everything to fall apart. So the mind keeps pushing forward like a train that forgot how to slow down. Maybe you've felt that train before. The replaying of awkward words long after the conversation ends. The anticipation of criticism that hasn't even happened yet. The restless feeling that you should be doing something, anything, right now, even when the room around you is perfectly quiet. But here's the gentle truth most people never hear. The rush inside us isn't always a demand from life. Often, it's just a habit the mind learned long ago. A habit that keeps the engine roaring even when the tracks ahead are empty. And habits, quietly enough, can be interrupted. In this story, you'll meet a man named Elias. For years, he believed the speed of his thoughts meant he was staying in control. But in reality, that speed was exhausting him and pulling him away from the present moment. Until one quiet encounter in a small park revealed something unexpected, a simple secret hidden in the space between breaths. It's not a complicated method. It doesn't require hours of practice or perfect discipline. In fact, it takes less than 10 seconds. Yet once you notice it, the entire rhythm of your mind can begin to change, like discovering the brakes on a train that's been running for years. So if your thoughts sometimes move faster than your life, if the pressure inside you feels louder than the world around you, stay with this story for a moment, because somewhere along the tracks ahead, you might rediscover something very simple, the power of a pause. Elias used to wake up with the strange feeling that he was already late. Nothing had happened yet. The room was quiet, the morning still soft, and yet his mind was already running somewhere far ahead of him. Thoughts stacked on top of each other like hurried footsteps in a narrow hallway. He would sit at the edge of the bed and wonder, softly, what exactly am I chasing? Through the day, the feeling followed him like an invisible clock ticking too loudly. A message unanswered, a memory of criticism, a small mistake from yesterday. Each one whispered that he should move faster, fix things sooner, try harder. His chest would tighten just a little, as if the air itself had become impatient. And somehow the day hadn't even properly begun. Sometimes the rush arrived without any clear reason at all. Elias could be standing in line for coffee, or tying his shoes. Yet inside, something urgent kept pushing him forward. His thoughts sprinted ahead while his body simply tried to keep up. It felt like living inside a train that never quite slowed down. The strange thing was that no one else seemed to hear that train. People around him moved calmly, chatting, sipping tea, strolling along sidewalks. But inside Elias, the wheels screeched against invisible rails. Every moment felt slightly behind schedule. Even silence somehow carried pressure. Once, during a quiet evening, he tried something unusual. He stopped walking halfway across the room and simply stood still. Not dramatically, just a small pause, really. But the moment he stopped, his mind protested loudly. A quiet fear whispered that everything might fall apart if he slowed down. It was an odd fear when he looked at it closely. Nothing around him was collapsing. No alarms were ringing. Yet the feeling remained, persistent as a dripping faucet. Keep going, don't stop. Sometimes he wondered what would happen if he truly paused. Not for a second while checking his phone. Not while thinking about the next thing, but a real pause. One where the rushing mind finally took a breath. Would calm quietly return, like a tide easing back to shore? He didn't know it yet, but that question was the beginning of something. Because somewhere beneath the noise of his racing thoughts, there was a simple possibility waiting patiently. A possibility that the rush inside him wasn't a command at all. And that discovery would begin with a pause. For years, Elias believed the rush inside him was simply part of being alive. Everyone seemed busy after all, always moving, always solving something. So he assumed the racing thoughts were necessary, like gears turning inside a clock. If the gears stopped, surely the whole mechanism would fail. Or at least, that was the story he quietly carried with him. But little by little, he began noticing something curious. The moments when his mind rushed the fastest were rarely the moments that truly required speed. He could be replaying an awkward conversation from 3 days ago, or imagining a criticism that hadn't even happened yet. The urgency felt real, but the situation often wasn't. One afternoon, while walking home under a pale sky, Elias felt the familiar pressure again. His thoughts were running ahead, predicting problems, preparing defenses. His chest tightened as if something important were about to collapse. Yet the street around him was peaceful. A stray cat stretched lazily in a patch of sunlight. That contrast puzzled him more than he expected. How could the world feel calm while his mind felt like a storm? It was almost as if the hurry lived entirely inside him, a habit of thought repeating itself again and again, a train accelerating even when the tracks ahead were empty. The strange thing about habits is that they often wear the mask of necessity. Elias didn't question the rush because it had always been there. It whispered that slowing down meant losing control, that pausing meant falling behind, and no one wants to feel left behind. Yet something small had begun to shift since that evening when he stopped in the middle of the room. Just that tiny pause had revealed something unexpected. For one brief moment, the racing thoughts hesitated, like a train coasting slightly before the next burst of speed. The movement had been interrupted, and in that tiny gap, something surprising appeared. A flicker of quiet, not dramatic, not magical, just a soft space. But it was enough for Elias to notice something he'd overlooked his entire life. The rush didn't run by itself. It moved because he kept feeding it attention. Thought after thought, worry after worry, reaction after reaction. But if even a small pause could interrupt that cycle, then perhaps calm wasn't something far away to chase. Perhaps it was something waiting quietly in the space between moments. And though Elias couldn't quite explain why, that thought followed him gently into the next chapter of his life, because somewhere ahead, without him realizing it yet, someone would show him exactly how powerful that pause could be, and how a runaway train might finally learn to slow. Most people who met Elias would have described him as responsible. He answered messages quickly, apologized often, and tried to fix things before they became problems. On the outside, he seemed organized, attentive, maybe even admirable, but inside, he felt like a man constantly running down a platform beside a moving train, always trying to catch something that never quite stopped. The train in his mind rarely rested. Each thought jumped onto the tracks and pulled another one behind it. A comment from a coworker, a memory of being ignored, a message that sounded colder than expected. Soon the wheels were screeching again, racing through imagined consequences. By evening, Elias felt as if he had traveled miles without leaving his chair. Mistakes began slipping through his hands like loose sand. He forgot simple things, misread tone, reacted faster than he meant to. Once, after receiving a brief message that simply said, "We need to talk," his mind built 10 different disasters before the hour had passed. The conversation, when it finally happened, turned out to be harmless. Still, the train had already burned through his energy. His shoulders stayed tense as though bracing for impact. Sleep often arrived late and shallow, like a guest unsure whether to stay. Even small disappointments carried the weight of something larger, and Elias couldn't quite explain why everything felt so heavy. The strangest part was the quiet distance growing around him. Friends would laugh during dinner, but Elias often arrived distracted. Someone would tell a story, and halfway through he realized he'd missed it. His thoughts had already boarded the train again, traveling somewhere urgent, somewhere imaginary. Now and then, he would notice how quickly he reacted to things. A sharp comment could ignite a long spiral of self-defense in his head. A moment of rejection could echo for hours. The train didn't just move fast. It refused to stop at any station. It carried him far beyond the present moment. Yet if someone had told Elias to simply slow down, he would have shaken his head. To him, slowing down felt dangerous. The world seemed to reward those who moved quickly, responded immediately, fixed everything at once. Stopping the train, even briefly, felt like abandoning control. And control was the one thing he believed he couldn't afford to lose. So he kept feeding the engine with attention, worry, and reaction. The train roared louder, the wheels spinning hotter against the rails. Days blurred together in a strange mixture of effort and exhaustion. And still, he believed that if he slowed down, everything would fall apart. What he didn't realize was how close he was to meeting someone who moved very differently. One evening, after another long day of rushing thoughts, Elias sat quietly by the window. The city outside moved in its usual rhythm. Cars passing, distant footsteps, a soft wind between buildings. Yet inside him, the familiar train was racing again, faster than ever. He could almost hear the wheels grinding along the rails of his mind, and for the first time, he imagined the train clearly. It was enormous, powerful, and strangely beautiful, polished metal gliding across endless tracks that stretched into the distance. But the engine roared far too loudly, steam bursting from every side. The speed was unsettling, as if the brakes had long since vanished, and Elias realized something uncomfortable. He was the only passenger. Each thought tossed another piece of coal into the furnace, a memory from childhood, a careless remark from a colleague, a moment of embarrassment that had happened years ago. The train devoured them all, turning them into heat and momentum. Soon the landscape outside the windows blurred into streaks of color. The faster it moved, the less he could see clearly. Small problems looked enormous at that speed. Tiny worries grew into looming mountains ahead of the tracks, and still the train kept accelerating. Sometimes Elias imagined the engine overheating, the metal glowing faintly red from the strain, the wheels screaming against the rails as sparks jumped into the air. It wasn't just movement anymore. It was pressure building with nowhere to go, a machine running harder than it was ever meant to. And yet, oddly enough, the train never crashed. It just kept racing endlessly through invisible landscapes, through imagined arguments, possible failures, and distant fears. Round and round, day after day, a journey without any real destination. Now and then, Elias would press his mental face against the window of that train. He'd glimpse quiet moments passing by outside, a laugh from a friend, the smell of coffee in the morning, the softness of evening light slipping through the room. But the train rarely slowed enough for him to step off. The engine was simply too used to running, too accustomed to the roar, the urgency, the endless forward motion. And Elias, sitting alone in the rushing cabin, had begun to believe that trains like this were never meant to stop. Still, somewhere far ahead on the tracks, there was a small station Elias had never noticed before, a place where someone stood waiting calmly beside the rails, someone who seemed completely unbothered by the noise of passing trains. And soon enough, their paths would quietly cross. One afternoon, after a restless morning of racing thoughts, Elias wandered into a small park he rarely noticed before. It was tucked quietly between two busy streets, almost as if the city had forgotten it existed. The benches were simple, the trees tall and patient, leaves whispering softly in the wind. For a moment, Elias felt that familiar train slowing just a little, not stopping exactly, but easing its grip. On one of the benches sat an older man, calmly feeding crumbs to a few bold pigeons. He moved slowly, not out of weakness, but with a kind of quiet precision. Each motion seemed deliberate, as if time itself had softened around him. Elias noticed something unusual right away. The man didn't seem rushed by anything at all. They exchanged a small nod, the kind strangers give when sharing the same quiet space. Elias sat down on the other end of the bench, still feeling the faint rumble of that train inside him. His mind began its usual commentary, things to fix, things to anticipate. But oddly, the park seemed to dampen the noise, like thick snow falling gently over loud machinery. After a while, the older man spoke, almost as if continuing a conversation already in progress. "Busy train today?" he asked with a faint smile. Elias blinked, a little surprised, then let out a quiet laugh. "Feels like it never stops," he admitted. The man nodded, as though he had heard this answer many times before. "You know," the man said softly, tossing another crumb to the birds, "trains only move when someone keeps feeding the engine." He didn't say it like a lesson, more like a simple observation about the weather, as if everyone already knew it. Elias watched the pigeons circle lazily around the bench. None of them seemed concerned about speed or urgency. For a moment, the contrast felt almost humorous. Here he was, carrying an entire railway system inside his head, while a few birds argued peacefully over breadcrumbs. "What if it's too late to slow down?" Elias asked after a while. The question slipped out before he could stop it. The old man chuckled gently, brushing crumbs from his hands. "It's never the train that's the problem," he said. "It's forgetting where the brakes are." The answer lingered in the quiet air between them. Elias felt something shift, not dramatically, just slightly. Like a lever somewhere deep inside, the engine had moved half an inch. He didn't understand exactly what the man meant yet, but somehow, he sensed that the real lesson hadn't even begun. The pigeons eventually wandered off, their small debate over crumbs peacefully resolved. The park returned to its quiet rhythm, leaves swaying like slow breaths in the afternoon air. Elias sat beside the older man, feeling that familiar train rumbling somewhere inside him. Not as violently as before, perhaps, but still moving, still pushing forward, as if it had somewhere urgent to be. The old man leaned back slightly and looked toward the distant trees. "You hear it, don't you?" he asked gently. Elias nodded, half smiling at how easily the stranger seemed to understand. "That train never gives me a day off," he admitted. The man chuckled softly, like someone greeting an old acquaintance. "Most people think the train controls them," the man said, "but the engine only roars because the driver keeps pulling the lever." He paused and tapped 2 fingers lightly on the wooden bench. "Not on purpose, of course. It becomes automatic." Then he added quietly, "But automatic doesn't mean unstoppable." Elias listened carefully, his curiosity now fully awake. The man closed his eyes for a brief moment and inhaled slowly. Not a dramatic breath, just a calm, steady one. Then he exhaled, long and unhurried, like a gentle wind passing through tall grass. "That," he said, opening his eyes again, "is where the brakes live." Elias frowned slightly, unsure if he understood. The old man noticed and smiled with patient warmth. "When the train speeds up, people usually add more fuel," he explained. "More thinking, more reacting, more chasing the next worry. But the secret is simpler than most expect." He lifted one hand and held it still in the air between them. "When the mind rushes, pause before the next thought grabs the wheel. Just a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3. Long enough to notice the breath moving in and out, long enough for the engine to hesitate." Then he gave Elias a small demonstration. "Close your eyes for a second," he suggested. Elias did, feeling slightly self-conscious at first. "Now take one slow breath and imagine the train coasting." For the briefest moment, the noise softened. Elias opened his eyes again, surprised by the tiny shift inside him. The train hadn't disappeared, of course, but it had slowed, not forced, not controlled, simply paused. And in that quiet gap, he felt something he hadn't noticed in years, a small space where calm had been waiting all along. The old man stood up, brushing invisible dust from his coat. "The brakes were always there," he said kindly. "Most people just forget to touch them." He began walking slowly down the path, leaving Elias sitting there, wondering how such a small pause could change so much. The next morning, Elias woke with the usual hum of the train already stirring. Thoughts lined up quickly, things he might forget, conversations he should replay, worries waiting for attention. For a moment, the engine began its familiar acceleration. But then he remembered the old man's quiet gesture in the park, just a small pause, before the next lever was pulled. So Elias sat still on the edge of his bed and tried it. One slow breath in, gentle and unforced. One slow breath out, like steam easing from a cooling engine. It felt almost too simple to matter, and yet the train inside him hesitated for a second. Later that day, someone at work made a careless remark about a mistake he had made. Usually, that would have sent the train roaring down a long track of self-defense and worry. His mind would rush to explain, replay, justify, regret. But this time, Elias paused before responding. Just one quiet breath before the next thought grabbed the wheel. To his surprise, the world didn't collapse during that pause. No alarm sounded, no disaster unfolded. Instead, something curious happened. The words that came out of his mouth were calmer than he expected. Even the other person softened a little. The train still moved, of course. Old habits don't disappear overnight. Some days the wheels still screeched loudly against the rails. But now Elias knew something he hadn't known before. There was a break hidden between moments. He began practicing the pause in small, almost playful ways. Before opening a message that felt tense. Before answering a difficult question. Sometimes even while waiting for the kettle to boil. One breath, then another, letting the train coast. Slowly, the engine began to sound different. Not silent, but steadier, more manageable. The wheels no longer screamed through every turn of thought. The landscape outside the windows became clearer again. Moments stopped blurring together quite so quickly. There were still difficult emotions along the tracks. Criticism, disappointment, the occasional sting of rejection. But Elias noticed that when the train slowed, those moments passed differently. They were no longer giant mountains ahead of the rails. Sometimes they were just small hills the train could glide over. Weeks passed, and the pauses grew more natural. Not forced, Not complicated, just small openings in the day, tiny spaces where the engine could rest for a moment. And somewhere in that growing quiet, Elias began sensing that the real test of this new rhythm had yet to arrive. One afternoon, the kind of afternoon that usually tightened his chest, Elias received a message that simply read, "We need to talk about the project." In the past, that short sentence would have sent the train screaming down the rails. His mind would have filled the engine with coal, mistakes, criticism, imagined disappointment. The wheels would spin faster with every passing second, and sure enough, the familiar rumble began. A quick tightening in his shoulders, a flash of old memories, being blamed, misunderstood, dismissed. The train started building speed the way it always had, but this time, Elias noticed it sooner. He didn't rush to respond. He didn't open the message again to reread every possible hidden meaning. Instead, he rested his hands on the desk and quietly remembered the bench in the park, the older man tapping 2 fingers gently on the wood, the quiet place where the brakes lived. So Elias paused. One slow inhale, like cool air filling an overheated engine. One long exhale, steam releasing softly from the train. For a brief moment, the wheels coasted instead of racing, and suddenly the tracks ahead looked different. When the conversation finally happened, something unexpected unfolded. The discussion was calm, even collaborative. A few adjustments were needed, nothing dramatic. No hidden disaster waiting behind the message. Just 2 people solving a small problem. Elias almost laughed afterward, not loudly, just a quiet, relieved smile. All that imagined chaos had lived only in the train, not in the room, not in the conversation, not in reality, just in the speed of his thoughts. Over the next days, he noticed more moments like that. A tense email, a brief misunderstanding, an awkward silence. Situations that once sent the train roaring into panic. Now they met a pause first. A simple breath before the engine could surge, and every time he paused, something subtle shifted. His words became clearer, his reactions gentler. Even the people around him seemed to relax in response. It was as if the entire railway system had learned a new rhythm. Of course, the train still existed. Life had not become perfectly quiet or predictable. But now Elias knew something he had never understood before. Speed was not the only way forward, and soon he would discover that anyone, anywhere, could step into that pause. One evening, while walking home beneath a sky slowly turning gold, Elias noticed something curious. The train inside him had been quiet for most of the day. Not silent, of course, but calm enough that he could hear other things again. Birds settling on power lines, distant laughter from a cafe, the steady rhythm of his own steps. And suddenly he wondered how many people were riding trains they didn't even notice. He remembered the old man in the park and the way he had demonstrated the pause. Such a small thing, almost too simple to believe, yet it had changed the way the entire engine moved. Elias smiled softly and imagined sharing that moment with someone else. Just a tiny practice, no effort required. So, if someone had been walking beside him that evening, he might have said something like this: "Let's try something together for a few seconds. Nothing dramatic, nothing complicated. Just pause wherever you are right now. Even if the train in your mind is already rumbling. Let your shoulders soften a little. Take one slow breath in through your nose. Not a big forced breath, just a gentle one, like filling a quiet room with air. Then let it leave slowly, as if steam were easing out of an engine. Notice what happens in that tiny space. Often the train hesitates, just for a moment. The wheels don't disappear, but they lose some of their urgency. Thoughts that felt enormous begin shrinking back to their natural size, and suddenly the tracks ahead look clearer. Elias liked to repeat this small pause throughout his day, before answering a difficult message, before responding to criticism or an awkward silence, sometimes even before stepping through a doorway. A simple breath, like touching the brakes for a second. He once joked quietly to himself that it was the shortest journey he had ever taken. One breath in, one breath out. Yet somehow that tiny distance carried him away from panic and back to clarity. A journey measured not in miles, but in moments of attention. And the more often he practiced, the more natural it became. The train still moved, but now it respected the stations along the track. Small pauses where the engine could cool and the view could return. Places where anyone could step off for a moment. Places where calm quietly waited to be rediscovered. And in time, Elias began to understand something even deeper about that pause. Something the old man had hinted at but never fully explained. Because the real gift of slowing the train wasn't just peace. It was discovering who you become when the noise finally settles. One quiet morning, Elias returned to the small park where everything had begun. The same bench waited beneath the tall trees, sunlight filtering gently through the leaves. He sat down slowly, noticing how different the world felt when the train inside him moved calmly. The city was still busy. People still hurried past the gates. But inside, something had settled into a steady rhythm. For a moment, he closed his eyes and listened. The train was there, of course. It always would be. Thoughts still arrived. Small worries still tapped at the windows. But the engine no longer screamed for attention. It simply moved, patient and controlled. Elias imagined the tracks stretching through his life, past moments of criticism, disappointment, and those lonely nights when everything felt too heavy. He could see now how fast the train had once rushed through those places. So fast that he had barely understood what he was feeling. Speed had blurred everything into one long, anxious journey, but the pauses had changed the landscape. Now the train slowed when the tracks curved sharply. It paused at quiet stations where clarity waited like a calm platform. And in those still moments, Elias could step out of the cabin of his thoughts, just long enough to see the sky again. He realized something the old man had quietly known all along. Calm wasn't hiding somewhere far away. It wasn't waiting at the end of endless effort or perfect control. It appeared the moment space was allowed to exist, right there between one breath and the next. So Elias sat there on the bench, breathing slowly, watching the world pass by. A child laughed near the fountain. Leaves drifted lazily across the path. Even the pigeons seemed to move without hurry, and the train inside him rested peacefully at the station. The strange thing was how ordinary it all felt. No grand transformation, no dramatic revelation, just a quieter mind, a steadier heart, a gentler pace through the day. Sometimes the greatest change doesn't roar like a speeding engine. Sometimes it arrives as a simple pause. Before leaving the park, Elias placed his hand lightly over his chest. He took one slow breath in, one slow breath out, a tiny ritual now woven into the tracks of his life. A reminder that the brakes were always within reach. And as he walked away, the train moved again, not racing, not fighting the rails, but gliding forward with quiet confidence. Because once someone learns where the pause lives, they discover something far more powerful than speed. They discover how to guide the journey from within.